to where I've really had to make adjustments over the course of my life based on perspective, my perspective, the perspective of others, how I viewed certain things. I just noticed here in this passage from a different perspective that maybe it wasn't the fruit that was bad. Maybe it was just a test to see if she would continue to follow God's will for her life or her own will. It was that moment when God gave that free will choice when he said, "You shall not eat of it or touch it lest you die." That was the test, not the fruit. When, there's so many different times in my life that I can look back on where it's so strange that I just spent so much time thinking about perspective. Just as a little kid, when I thought I was so cool, and then I went to public school and people did not look at me the way that I thought that I looked at me, I was not so cool. I got picked on and bullied. And I just remember thinking at like 10 years old, why am I thinking about perspective at 10 years old? Why is their perspective of me different than mine? How can I change this perspective they have of me? And that seems strange, but it just kept coming up. Like in college, again, I would spend a lot of time thinking about perspective. And then I remember being on a job once, and I was a team lead, and I applied for a supervisor position, and I didn't get it, and I didn't understand why, because I was producing better results than everybody else, all the other team leads. And I told that to my supervisor, or the people that interviewed me, why I'm producing better results than everybody else. And they said, it's because of the perspective that the higher-ups have of you. They see you as a rebel. They see you as a rule breaker. They don't like the perspective they have of you. You have to change their perception. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that and dwelling on that. In 2017, I watched it. See, I'm a big fan of Jim Carrey. I followed his career in acting. I love all of his movies. I followed his personal life a little bit. And Jim Carrey went through a lot of similar things to me. He spent a lot of time thinking about perspective and how people perceived him and just, the meaning of life, I guess. And in 2017, he really got to the bottom of the barrel, and I watched this interview of him, and his beard was growing out wild, and his hair wild and crazy, and he just kind of sat down and said, I just kind of give up. He said, there's no point in trying to convince anybody of anything because everybody has their own perspective. You can do everything you can to get somebody to look at your perspective, but the closest you can get is them looking over your shoulder, and they still don't have the exact same perspective as you. So and that really sat with me. I dwelled on that for years. He's right. The ironic thing is I had the exact same perspective as Jim Carrey about nobody has your exact same perspective. Think about that for a minute. But I agreed with him. How can I get through to anybody? Everybody's always going to have their own perspective. And perspective is a funny thing because there can be a true perspective that's opposite another true perspective. Like my road to my house. I could honestly say that road is terrible. It is dirt and mud and potholes, and it'll jar your teeth driving down it. And that's a true perspective. But I could also say that is the best road there is because it leads to my house, my home, my loved ones. It's also a true perspective. So you always have to, I'm always trying to consider what the different perspectives are because there's multiple. It's just how you want to look at it. Let me read Matthew 22 and then go on a little bit more. Matthew 22, verse 36 through 40. I'm sure a lot of you know this. It says, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So, and going back to my personal thoughts on perspective, when I first met my wife, Stacy, whom I love very, very much, probably a lot of you would agree that when you're first getting into a relationship with someone, you do a lot more looking at the world through their perspective, right? You want to know how they see things. You want to know how they think about things. You want to know everything about them, whether you can like them or not, or whether you can agree with them, whether you can be cohesive together. And that's, that leads to love and a deep loving relationship together. But as years went on and life got more difficult, Stacy and I went through a lot of very serious trouble. We fought and argued and did not get along very well most of the time. We were like a roller coaster, We would have some good times and a lot of bad times, arguing, bad fights, yelling, screaming, threatening to leave, threatening to divorce, just an up and down relationship. But most of the time, the way we would come out of that bad time is we would start thinking about, we would get time away from each other enough to start thinking about the other person's perspective and where they're coming from. And a lot of the times, I could be 100% right from my perspective, and I would stand on that, I know I'm 100% right from my perspective. And she would be also 100% right from her perspective. But we would fight and go at it and just argue because we refused to look at anything besides our own perspective that we were so sure we were right about. It would really take us getting to the bottom and thinking about the other person's perspective for a little bit to bring us back together. But that only did so much, that only band-aided it a little while until the next fight. The thing that really changed everything for us is God, When we each individually decided to follow God's will, God's perspective, I can tell you marriage is 100% better with God in the beginning of it. Life is 100% better with God in it. All of the things that I used to look for to get to know Stacy and to fall in love with her about, I still love her for. But now, the one thing that I probably love her the most for is that she has a deep relationship with God, and that she continues to go deeper and deeper with her relationship with God. And that's important to me, because that's what I want too. So, and going back to Matthew 22:37 and the two commandments. What if love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind is like that relationship? It's like seeking that deep relationship with God where you're trying to see everything from their perspective. You're putting your own perspective last. And you're thinking about what's God's will. You're always constantly seeking God's will. And then love your neighbors as yourself. What if we put aside our own perspectives? We might feel so strongly about something and just know that we're right. But if you can put that aside and consider everybody else and where they're at, what they need, if you're bringing God's will first and then considering where they're at and what they need, you fulfill all the law and the prophets. You have love. You have bond. You have relationship. So, back to what Jim Carrey said. Like I said, that really floored me when he said, you never can really get through to anybody because everybody has their own perspective. Well, then recently, I think this year, in 2023, Jim Carrey was speaking to a bunch of inmates, ex-cons, gang members, and he simply talked to them about how his suffering had led to salvation. And he talked about Jesus on the cross and the suffering that Jesus went through. And I'm like, you know what, Jim, you figured it out. You know, you found the thing that can get everybody on the same page, that can get everybody in unity, that can get everybody together with the same perspective. And that's planting your knees at the foot of the cross. You know, that's looking at Jesus and what he did for us. Because when you're on your knees at the cross, you see God's perspective. You see God's will for you. He so loved the world. He gave his only begotten son. You see that there. You know, when you're at the cross, that's where you get washed in the blood. Jesus told the woman at the well, you know, if you knew who asked you for water, you would ask me for water, and I would give you living water, springing up. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But when Jesus took that final spear, poured out blood and water, you know, so you stay at the cross, and that's where Jesus gives you the blood that cleans you, and Jesus gives you the water of life. So for real unity, if we could all just focus on the gospel. You know, Paul said in Galatians 1:6-9, I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed. So Paul's really, he says it twice. You know, he's saying, listen to the gospel that I preached to you only. No other gospel, just the gospel that I preached to you. And that's how you get in one accord. If you want to go further, what is the gospel that Paul preached? So we're clear. 1 Corinthians 15, 1-8. Moreover, brethren, I declare to you the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received and in which you stand, by which also you are saved, if you hold fast to that word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then the 12. After that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then last of all he was seen by me also, as by one born out of due time. So what is the gospel that Paul says twice is the only gospel you should preach or listen to? It's the death, burial, resurrection, and appearing ascension of Jesus. That puts us all in unity. That puts us all in the same perspective, God's perspective. And that's what I would really hope to see for this church.